We've also got a message from Peter Hall from Frontline City Church in Stirling. But before then, we're actually going to hear some of the children in Full Gospel Church sharing, and we're going to see the videos that they prepared earlier this month, during the month of April, for Easter.
And the angel told the woman, Jesus is alive.
Hi, Full Gospel Church, Dalkeith. Wonderful to be with you again, and thanks for the privilege of sharing the word with you again. A phrase I think that most Christians have said during the pandemic is that God is in control. God is in control. I am changing that to God is sovereign. That God is sovereign. God's sovereignty means that he acts independent of anything or anyone else. God's will is above all. And this means that God will have his way in the end. That gives me great comfort. God's sovereignty means that he's independent. He is supreme. No one is above him. No one makes his decisions for him. God is never at a loss. He's never frustrated. He's never helpless. And I don't know about you, but for me, that is a source of great comfort and great strength and great security. But do you know that God is not in control of everything? You see, God has limited himself to two things. Firstly, he has limited himself to your will. Have you noticed God doesn't override your will? God doesn't make you do anything, but he makes you willing. You see, when God comes with his grace in our lives, he changes our desires. You know, that seed of the kingdom that he planted in us when we were born again begins to grow, and his grace comes and changes our heart, changes our desires. By the way, grace is his action in me to do what I cannot do myself. So God doesn't override my will, even though he makes us willing. He doesn't override our will. So he's limited himself to our will. The second thing that God has limited himself to is his word. So God has limited himself to the promises that he has made to you. The promises he made to Abraham in the Abrahamic covenant back in Genesis. Righteousness by faith. The promises he made to David that there will always be a king on the throne, who, by the way, is Christ. Those promises, God has limited himself to keeping his word, keeping his promises. Now, because of that, we know that God is consistent, that God does not waver. We know how God thinks. And because of that, we can have great faith in God's sovereignty and his word. You know, God has laid out the purpose of our existence in his word. He told us that we are one with Christ, that we have been crucified with Christ, that we were buried with him in baptism. When we went into the water, we were buried with Christ. When we came out, we rose with Christ. And now we are one with him. And that one day we will have a resurrected body in a new creation And with an innumerable number of saints, we will rule and reign as joint heirs with Christ in a new heavens and new earth. Whatever that looks like, whatever that means, we don't fully know. But we can trust God and his sovereignty, that his plan is perfect and it will happen in the end. That gives me great comfort too. In fact, one reason why God is never flustered and God is at total rest is because he knows that his plan will work out in the end. In the end, he will have victory over all his enemies and our enemies, all opposition, and every knee will bow and tongue confess that Jesus is Lord. You know, one day everybody will say, God was right all along. Isn't that wonderful? I'm glad I'm on his side, and I'm glad he's on my side. So regardless of your opposition, and what I mean by that is regardless of the opposition in your life, regardless of your enemies, regardless of what the world is thinking, regardless of your pain, regardless of the circumstances you are in, regardless of all that, God will have his way in the end because he's sovereign. You know, I think of that great story in the Old Testament of Joseph. Joseph came up with that great line. Joseph, who was sold into a pit as a boy. Joseph, who was put in jail due to false allegations. Joseph, who God got out of jail and promoted to prime minister, said what the enemy meant for evil, God has turned around for good. See, that's God's sovereignty. Whatever the opposition, God can turn it around for good in your life. I'm reminded of when I pastored a church in Scotland, and there was a lady in her mid-70s who was a stalwart of the church. And she had a granddaughter who was, I guess, late 20s. And the granddaughter idolized her grandmother. And the grandmother invited the granddaughter to church, and she began to come to church. And after a while, she made a decision to follow Christ. Not long after she made that decision, the grandmother that she adored fell ill, and within a few short months, she died. And I did the funeral for this wonderful lady. And the granddaughter stopped coming to church. And she said this to me: I cannot believe in a God that would allow my gran to get sick and die. You see, what the granddaughter didn't believe in was that her grandmother, that she loved so much, would one day have a resurrected body, and that in a new creation she would rule and reign with Christ in a new heavens and new earth. You see, God's plan A is better than the granddaughter's plan A. And for so many things, we don't understand why things happen. And I think the phrase God is in control might even help that question. If God's in control, why did he allow such and such? But when we say God is sovereign, we can say God is sovereign over all, and he will have his way in the end. And sure, in the meantime, there might be pain, there's doubts, there's things we don't understand. In fact, the older I get, the more I know, the less I know. But one thing that I have a peace in my heart is that God is sovereign. He will have his way in the end. His plan A is better than my plan A. It reminds me of the prophets. in the Old Testament. When you read through the minor prophets in the Old Testament, in 586 BC, Judah was taken captive by the Babylonians. Jeremiah was in Jerusalem, Ezekiel was in Babylon, Daniel was in Babylon. And the people in that day must have wondered, where is God in all this? How could God allow this to happen? Little did they know that 40 years later, the Persians would rise up and be the dominant culture, the dominant civilization. Then there would be Greece, then there would be Rome. So many changes in cultures and civilizations and power structures. But in God's sovereignty through it all, the seed was preserved for Christ to be born at exactly the right time, in the right place. And that seed, called Jesus, was going to be crucified and rise again and save the whole world. Now that's God's sovereignty. His plan A is better than our plan A. As we come out of the pandemic, whatever you will face, whatever your circumstances will be, whatever your fears will be, remember, God is sovereign. No weapon that is formed against you will prosper. Even when things seem strange and different and hopeless, God is sovereign. And He has used this pandemic to do His work behind the scenes. Nothing is outside His sovereign will. God bless you, friends. Be encouraged.